Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of TEQ. Today, we're going to talk about when inclusion increases safety, navigating equity in generative AI creation. If you've been here before, you know that this podcast is about the intersection of technology, society, and the future possibility that technology brings. And today, to discuss some of that, I have the honor of having Tim Bardlavens, who is the Director of Product Equity at Adobe. Tim has spent a decade building and scaling teams and setting product visions and strategy in different companies from Zillow to Microsoft, Capital One, and Meta. He is also a member of the Adobe Design Circle, which is an initiative that uses scholarship and mentorship to transform the design industry by promoting greater diversity and creating more visibility to career path to design. He's also the co-founder of End Design, an organization that cultivates and activates Black, Latinx, and Indigenous designers by providing tools, resources, and training to support them in their creative career journey. Please help me welcome Tim to the conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. I want to start off with something that just took me by surprise because you don't see that often being spelled out so eloquently, which is a statement on the Adobe Product Equity Team landing page that says, if exclusions is ignorance or avoidance of our differences, our struggles, our experiences, our knowledge, our needs, and our abilities, then inclusion is our acknowledgement and acceptance of them. If exclusion separates, inclusion connects. And that is so beautifully stated. And I want to start with asking you, what is your definition of inclusion when we're talking about AI and generative AI and creativity in particular?
Yeah, and actually, I would even expand the definition to like, what do we talk about equity, right? And the reason I do that is because it's sort of twofold. So I usually tell people that equity is greater than and equal to inclusion. And so when we think about inclusion, we think about it through the lens of we invite people to the table, but are they actually allowed to sit? Maybe they sit at the table, but they're allowed to speak. If they're allowed to speak, then does that mean we have to listen? If we listen, does that mean we have to take action? If we take action, do we have to be held accountable to those actions? And so, like all those things, and that accountability, especially, is where equity comes in. And so, when we think about it through the lens of tech, a lot of this is really thinking about it in a few different ways. One is, or excuse me, in Gen AI, one of them is around like how do we build for and with community. And so, a lot of what we're doing and trying to do when it comes to AI is you'll see some companies are kind of like building in corners and they come out, hey, look, we have this new thing. But in reality, some of the best innovation you get is actually from building with community and understand what those communities need. Secondarily, what that looks like is around like how do you increase discoverable representation? And so it's not just representation period, but how do you ensure it's discoverable? Like how do you ensure that if you're using some
Mm,
type of general technology and you search for just, let's say, a portrait of a human, you should be able to see a multifaceted view of humanness that is generated out from that. And if you're not, then how are we failing when it comes to discoverable representation? And then how do we actually go towards getting there, right? But then it's like a step further than discoverable representation is how do we ensure accurate, respectful, and diverse representation of people, cultures, and identities? And so there's layers to this that you start to think about where first it's well, we just need to make sure that we're working with community and that we're ensuring that people can sort of find, let's say, folks that look like them. But even more is not only does someone look like me, but it feels accurate, it feels respectful, and it's not
that's right.
biased or stereotypical. And then it's actually looking at maybe the breadth of the culture. And so, from as a black man in America, we say all the time that black is not a monolith. And so being able to
Yes.
see the full version of what humanness looks like is super important, especially in generative technology. And then the last thing I'll say is, what does this look like is sort of leaning in on Adobe's AI ethics principles around accountability, responsibility, and transparency. those are actually also parts of equity and inclusion, because if we can't take responsibility for actions, if we can't have the public especially hold us accountable to the things that we don't do well, inclusive as well as the things that we do well, and we're not transparent about how this technology is used and how people have to participate in that technology, then we're failing in ensuring that people have access to the information they need to make the best decision that's for them.
And it's interesting because first of all, I couldn't agree more, of course. But it was my second question was exactly to your point that you know I, when Adobe started, it was a journey, right? And you started out with the initial focus was on accessibility, and then from
Mhm.
accessibility, you kind of moved and you broaden your definition of inclusion when it came to what you focus on for your products. And you know that intersectionality that you talked about is absolutely critical. That is you know that we represent all facets, to your point, in order to get to an equitable product, right? Because otherwise we are missing parts of a human being, or you
Mhm.
know representation in all the different ways that we think
Yeah.
about it. And you seem to agree with that, right? That
Mhm.
we need intersectionality to play a role, but
Yeah.
that's often not considered. Like
Yeah.
it's interesting to me as a white person. I am very well aware of my privilege, but I'm also a woman. So the intersectionality of me being a white but a woman, not a
Mhm.
man, brings in a different way that I move around the world, corporate or not corporate. And I
Yeah.
think that when it comes to products, is the same thing. Is who do we consider when we are building a product?
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting, so you labeled some of your identities, but I think in there is also you have an accent, right? And so how
That's
does
right.
that
I'm an
also create
immigrant.
issues, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And so like there's these layers of humanness that comes with that. And so and like usually like I think you probably know more than anyone that if you try to do voice to text or some type of speech dictation thing, it's
Yes.
so annoying because there's so many words that doesn't understand you because of your accent. And then the question becomes, what was that model trained on for it to not understand you? And then how long does it take for it to learn you as a human? And how does Carolina talk? And how does that show up? And what do these things mean? And it takes you having to go through the work of like correcting the system and things like that. And so it's definitely an issue or a challenge. And honestly, I find it like it really is something that is a muscle that's still strengthening across companies, right? Like Adobe is still strengthening its muscle. And I think we're much further along than some companies, but we still are trying to get there. And the muscle that really needs to be strengthened is really anchoring in on what we call target universalism. And this is something that comes out of Stanford and I'm going to completely butcher the name of the department, but it's around uh, belonging and is around belonging and inclusion. And I'm blanking on what it's called now. But the important thing is that targeted universalism really says, hey, there's a universal goal, and it could be, everyone wants to have enough money for retirement or something like
Mm.
that. And you say, with that universal goal, who is the most pained in getting there? Like, who has the hardest time? And then how do
Mm.
we understand how
Yes.
to design for them? And then if we can design for them, then we can actually expand it to the broader audience. And so
Yep.
we
I'm
take this,
familiar with
we
that.
take
Mhm.
exactly. And so we take target universalism and we say, well, is ultimately at its core is designed for one, expand to many. And one
Yeah.
could mean one person, one community, one country. It could mean a lot of things. But the goal is to say, who is the most marginalized of marginalized individuals? And then how do we solve for their problem and then expand to the broader community, whether it's like the broader user base or something like that. And so in the US, the most marginalized of marginalized person is a disabled Black trans woman, right? And
Yeah.
so there's all the intersections of what does it mean to be a Black person, a woman, a disabled person, and excuse me, trans in the US. And then how does that show up in how I navigate the world? And an example I've used in previous talks is like, let's think of apps, different apps, whether it's financial app or even, like a Lyft, a ride sharing app, right? And verify your identity, you need to be able to have, let's say, an ID card. But if you're trans, if your ID does not directly correlate to who you are as your
Yes.
identity, you might not have that. Or it might be that you don't have access to, let's say, a bank account to verify that you have something you can send money into from a financial app, because there's historic issues around redlining and other things that have prevented many, especially Black people, from even feeling comfortable to create bank accounts. Like, there's so many things you can start to see where how these
Yeah.
intersectional identities actually keep some people from attaining similar common goals. And then we say, well, how do we actually solve for that? And that's really what like the power of looking at intersectional identities in our work and in tech is so great and so important, because that's also what drives innovation. If you can solve for that particular use case that's like really, like say, really gnarly, then it might actually open the doors to make a really easy experience for multiple people
For
who may
somebody
not
else.
have.
Yeah.
Exactly. And they may not feel the same pain as deeply, but it still might be useful. And so that's really like the power of intersectional identities and understanding them and leaning on them in product development processes.
That's awesome. And sadly, I don't know that we do that. Well, definitely we don't do it enough, but not even of a bare minimum, because we always tend to, especially in the tech world, right? It is
Mhm.
always about. It seems like we focus more on giving more to the ones that already have,
Yeah.
and we're talking about more the exciting part, or how we can make life more comfortable for the people that already have the comfort, instead of
Yeah.
addressing it from the people that actually, for whom that product could be a truly life changer, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So the consequences of exclusion are very dire, and we know what
Yeah.
that means. But when it comes to AI, and generative AI
Hmm.
in particular, are there steps that a company can take to navigate how to bring to market a product that is equitable, or as equitable as it can be?
Absolutely. I mean, there are things, let's say, processes and approaches you can take within the development process, but then there are also guardrails and other things you can have in place as well. So what does that look like? Starts with, and the very easy one is knowing what your data set is coming from, like what is actually in it. And having the ability to know what's in that data set and what the gaps are is very important and also really hard work, but it takes dedication to do that. Secondarily is, as you build out the data set, is how are you considering how you build out the model, and how do you make sure the model is as robust as possible. Many times what we find is that companies will try to solve for gaps in the data set by using pre and post processing techniques, and that is just like using duct tape and glue. It can only last for so long, right? You can have only so many block and deny lists. You can have only so many, different sort of positive and negative sort of weights on things, right? And so, if you actually can address some of these challenges at the data set and model level, then it actually makes it much easier to build and scale AI products, and then to bring new use cases with them, because you know that you have a robust foundation, and you know that there are ways in which you can experiment with the model and things like that to see what are the boundaries. Will it hallucinate? If it does, how far does
Right.
it hallucinate? All those things, right? And so, like, that is the processes side, and that includes, like, it's something that we've been really working on developing more and more at the company, is like, how do we anchor in on our red, blue, and purple teams? So red teaming is, this is like actually security terminology, right? And so red teaming, of course, is adversarial testing. And so we say we're building this product, but we're also going to intentionally try to make it do bad things, because we want to
Mm,
see where it is, where are the boundaries, what is the prevalence of those potential bad outcomes, and then how can we create mitigation strategies to reduce or remove them, right? And so it helps with benchmarking and things like that. And then on the other side is, like, then you say, okay, well, if the red team is the one who's doing the adversarial testing to just see how we can break the system, to see what happens, and this is for both intentional and unintentional harm and bias, or lack of culturalization, then the purple team is actually taking those learnings and saying, okay, cool, we see the problem, now let's route it to the proper organizations, proper teams, proper people, to make sure that they have awareness and we can start building out solutions. And then the blue team is the one who's receiving the input from the purple team to say, oh, we hear the problem. Let's actually figure out how do we build the solution. And then once we built the solution, let's send it back to the red team because then they can test it again, test for prevalence, do scientific and human evaluations, things like that. And ultimately, you can start to see, okay, we found a problem. We think we fixed the problem. We tested it again. We tested to see if there was any level of prevalence, how much or how little. And then what is our benchmark for good enough or not? Okay, it's good to go. Let's release this next model. And so there are ways in which we can actually do this work from a process perspective that allows for having more safe development of AI products. On the other side is the human component. You need both human and like you need humans involved in all parts of the process.
Yeah.
You need human annotations. You need people who can actually visually look at the things because I think a lot of times what companies do is they create this AI and then they create another thing, like another machine to like test
Yeah.
and look and understand, right? And so it's like machines are like looking at machines and everyone's like, oh, we don't know what happened. Well, no human actually looked at this to really understand what was going on, right? And so
Yeah.
like that's super important, is having humans in place. And so the big thing that we're trying to work on is, for example, how do we do like community-led annotations? Like, how do we say, hey, we want to do better about making sure that disabled people are represented in our products? Well, disabled people should be the ones who can help us better define what it means to have accurate and respectful representation. So, how
That's
do we
right.
lean on community to teach us and help us, and then how can we reciprocate that back to community? And so we have the checks and balances that come from the processes we have in place. We have connection to community to ensure we have accurate, positive, and respectful representation. And then on top of that is deeply sort of this like undertone of responsible AI, right, or ethics, right? And with that comes this thing of I'll say I've been at many companies where responsible AI lives in a different part of the org than
Yes.
product. And so they never actually land any of their principles in the product effectively. And so one of the most
It's
important
almost
things,
an afterthought or, like an
yes,
aside instead of being baked in from the beginning.
exactly. And I think the most important, most critical thing for every company to do is to have an AI ethics or a responsible AI team that is deeply embedded with and working with product. Because that hand in hand conversation between product development and research and development and assessments and all those things, like that hand in hand collaboration is what actually makes sure we have effective products and effective AI products that don't have the high prevalence of harm or bias, and they do respect people's cultural identities. But it takes that sort of really hard work, and it also means that we have to figure out what does it mean to go. Like a lot of companies are moving fast, and but they don't have velocity. And what I mean by that is they're going fast. We're building things very quickly, right? But velocity is about direction. Where are you going with this?
Mm,
What is the purpose of it? What is the vision behind it? What is it for? Are we moving quickly because the market is moving quickly? Are we moving quickly because there's an intentional decision that we're making to help people with blank, whether it's help people in their lives when it
right.
comes to productivity, being more effective, whatever that is. But it requires velocity, which is moving at a direction, in a specific direction intentionally. And that's something that I really push any company to focus in on.
I love this because it's true that especially we've seen it with AI, right? Where one
Mhm,
company went first and everybody else was scramming, trying to get on the bandwagon and deliver. But maybe that intentionality wasn't
mhm,
always really scoped out and in focus. And we know what that when that happens, what the consequences are, right? So
mhm,
when you're looking at a product like Firefly,
mhm.
what were some of the, I guess, the hurdles that you faced in trying to create a product that not only minimized exposure to harmful and offensive content, but also ensured, diverse in presentation, representation, and also assure people of intellectual properties, right?
Yeah.
You give to the creators what the creators are due.
Yeah. I think I'll start with the latter one because I think it's the toughest one, but the one I feel like we tried to solve very early on. Because I will say internally, there are a lot of people concerned, like, oh, what would this mean for the creative community? How do we make sure they still feel supported? How do we make sure they know that we're emphasizing their work, not trying to replace their work? And I think
Right.
a lot of it boiled down to the company's approach to saying, hey, we're going to start with the baseline of we're only going to use our data from like public sources and stock, right? Our stock platform. And so the great thing about that was like, us saying, hey, this is a commercially, viable or commercially safe product to use isn't just marketing, but it actually is in support of the creative community in many ways because by us making sure that folks who are contributing to these different platforms like stock, they are aware that what we're going to use their products or their images or whatever for, then that awareness is great because then they are paid for that with transparency, knowing that, hey, this is how it's going to be used, right? And so then that means that before anything even feeds into Firefly, we've already sort of made that agreement with whoever the creatives are and ensured that there is a level of responsibility that we've taken in them knowing what is the usage of their work and how should they go about learning more about how it's used, right? Like, do they have resources to learn more? Now, on the harm and bias front, and as well as, and I think especially around increasing culturalization, that has been the most difficult. The
Mm.
culturalization side, because we are still a US based company, right? And while we have people all across the world as employees, it's really tough. Like, India is a great example of so many people and cultures and celebrations and identities in one country.
Yep.
It's when people say, hey, we're going to expand to India. I really think sometimes people think, oh, it's just a place with Indian
It's
people and they're all the
homogeneous.
same.
Yeah,
Right, it's all the same. It's like, no, actually, the difference between North, South, and East and West, India is can
absolutely.
be very different, and
Culturally,
if you don't
languages.
exactly, and so if you don't respect that part of it, then it's really
Yeah.
easy for you to go in and fail, and so culturalization is really tough because it actually requires you to work with, again, community to understand the culture, understand, and it's not something we can ever be perfect at, but at least we can get better, right? And that's the goal is to get better over time, and so culturalization is tough because it does require a very global approach to how we build the product and how we understand people. Harm and bias is super tough. I would say the hardest thing for Firefly early on for us was ultimately expanding our definition of what harm and bias means. Like originally, and this is a company that, has had to transition from people are just using our tools to now they're actually creating things on our platform, right? And so
Right.
it's this cultural shift of it's just a tool to, oh, people are actually creating. So it's Adobe allowed me to create now, right? And so how do we think about that? And how do we expand our definition of what harm should look like? How do we think about things like violence and gore in a way where we may help people maintain their creative autonomy, while also protecting users who may not want to see all the blood and gore and things, right? How to respect people again globally, where let's say if you search for let's say a queer couple and you are based in the US, maybe we show something, but if you're in a country where it's illegal, then do we have any type of mechanisms to make sure they can protect themselves, because we have our values as a company, but also there's a level of impact on others who still generate these things, and it might have some effect on them based on what is the culture of that country or locale. So there's a lot of really hard pieces to this work, and I think it is something where I think at least I don't think comms would kick me if I said we're not perfect yet, because we're not. Like we still have much more to do, but I think we've made a ton of really great strides, which is nice.
Well, I think, first of all, I think that acknowledging that you're not perfect is actually a step closer to being perfect. That's how I take it, because being
Mm.
self-aware is absolutely critical, and tech oftentimes is not, right. We're just getting, we're very engineer driven
Mhm.
vertical. We're pushing through because it's technologically possible, then we're
Yeah.
just doing it, even if socially it might not be the best thing to do, right. So I mean that I love that, the fact that you are acknowledging that there's still work to be done. I think the other part that I find interesting is, and I often highlight, is AI cannot fix what is broken in reality, right? In the real world. Like AI is not gonna get rid of bias when there is bias because it's there. Like you
Mhm.
cannot, fudge it. And we shouldn't
Mhm.
expect AI to be unbiased when life is biased. And so to your point, we need to solve the representation, and we need to have the voices at the table that will bring that. um,
Yeah.
but how do you do that in an environment where just saying the word inclusion gets you pigeonholed in the whole woke movement?
Mhm.
And how do you bring along your developers and creators to also take responsibility to really use generative AI in an ethical way? So, not just about your responsibility in creating an
Yeah.
equitable product, but then help the users of your product do that in an ethical way.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? And I'll say, like, I have equity in my title, and so most people who, and this is especially true for the tech field, where bias is how we navigate everything. Like, there is a bias to what you believe a designer does or doesn't do, what an engineer or PM can or can't do. And so, while I am a product leader because I have an equity title in my name, people assume, oh, it's just the diversity stuff, as opposed to actually we're doing some really hard down product development and like very technical work with folks to really drive out the impacts that, or the outcomes that we want. I think is sort of tough because when you think about our customers who are using these products, one of the things that we have to become more and more aware of and more able to educate our customers on is the impact of misinformation and disinformation,
Yeah.
right? And the difference between misinformation and disinformation is misinformation is something that is done unintentionally, whereas disinformation is done intentionally. And so, one of the things that we have to talk to more and more people about is what is the potential impact of a person or like this image you generated, you just throw it up on Instagram or something. What is the potential impact that it could have, right?
Right.
Because we've literally seen this where people have created a thing and they threw it up and say, hey, this is just an experiment. But then all of a sudden, like, oh no, someone bombed the CIA or something like that. Like, is like all of a sudden there are articles and things written about it because it's assumed to be true. And so, like, it's really tough, especially in this age. And I know like Adobe has the content authenticity initiative, which
Hmm.
helps at least people better recognize or be able to look up and see if something has been modified, especially with AI. But I think that one, it's still expanding and growing, and the layman doesn't have access to it in the same way just yet as like a pro would. But that means that there are other ways in which we can actually push people to be more critical about content that they're reviewing or content they're posting. And so I do think that there's some level of responsibility on every company that has generative AI as in any form to be able to say, hey, you should be careful when you make this. When you're posting this out, when you're creating these things, just be mindful of the potential impact of the society, like some societal impact that it might
Right.
have, because we all are responsible for what comes out of these technologies, both as technologists, but also as individuals who are customers who are just using it and buying credits to create a thing.
We always have more questions, and the conversation can be always longer than the time that I have. But before I let you go,
Mhm,
from a user perspective, I'm a
mhm,
user of Firefly. Are there ethical steps that I should consider whenever I use your tools to create content? You talked about, from the companies that generate this content and put it out
mhm.
there, but from a user perspective, what should I think about when I'm using these tools? And it could be from a Firefly perspective, or it can be, if I use, I don't know, Gemini to create a
Mhm.
letter, or you know, we talked about articles being generated by AI,
Mhm.
anything like that.
Um, a couple things. One is, I'm not sure who said this, but it was a really great quote that where they were talking about how AI is a really good tool to look back, because
Mm.
ultimately it's a collage of the past. It's a collage of what already exists, and the thing that it outputs it may feel new, but it's still a collection of a bunch of old things. And so I say that with the undertone of like humans are still important for innovation.
Yes.
Because you have a thing that looks back, but you actually need humans to be able to look forward, you know? But like, and I say that because, when you're creating these things, again, you have to be conscious of what is the potential impact, whether it's societal or something, it could be smaller or bigger. As a customer, especially, like, it should be, I would say, twofold. One, I believe it's every customer's ethical responsibility to just submit a report or flag something if it's wrong, right? You must communicate back to the system that something that did was bad so that we can fix the systems. And so, like at
Mm,
Adobe, we look at evaluation as, we're looking at it proactive and reactive. Proactive is all the work we're trying to do around harm and bias evaluations and red teaming and things like that. Reactive is someone submitted a report, which then allows us to go and test to see how much prevalence of that thing it is. And then we can go work through mitigating strategies now that we understand it. So we need that communication back. So that's one thing. The second thing is, um, honestly, attribute attribute the work. If
yeah.
it's a creative work, say, hey, I generated this using blank. Like, attribution is still important even in the AI world, because there's still impact there. Like, there's still something where you can say, I created this really cool thing using this platform, and you still created it, because prompt engineering is hard. I don't know if, like, anyone who's tried Gen AI, prompt engineering is hard, which is why they call it prompt engineering. And so every layperson can't just up and create this great masterpiece overnight. And I think over time, as the technology improves, it will become easier to do that. But it's really tough. And so attributing, hey, this is what I use this platform for, and this is how I went about it. Like, it helps educate other people on how to leverage the technology, and it just creates, I feel like, a sense of safety and openness to say, hey, we can use this tech and still create cool things and still celebrate it.
I love that because it's, in a way, if you think, I think you were talking, I was thinking about photography, and, we used to use now phones for everything that we take as a
Mhm.
picture, and a lot of it is AI modified, right? So you're
Mhm.
using things to make our shot better than it is, and we take pride in saying shot on iPhone. So why can it not be generated on XYZ, right? So
Mhm.
I think that's a very easy thing to do for people. Um, I wonder if maybe the difficult part is for people to think that they're less important. But that is kind of silly, right? Because to your point, the human aspect and the relevance that we have, it is about continue to innovate and generate new ideas and concepts and looking forward. So
Yes.
yes, it's amazing. And I really am grateful for your time today. I learned a lot, actually, of the complexities of AI within a product and the importance of thinking about equitable or not just inclusion, but really representation in a product from the
Mm.
very beginning. So I really thank you. And I want the conversation to always continue past our 30 minutes. So where can people find you?
I am most active on LinkedIn, and it's just my name. Also on Instagram. I used to have an X, Twitter, whatever you call it, but not really there as much anymore. So yeah, if you want to, feel free to follow me on LinkedIn, and on Instagram. It's my last on Instagram. It's my last name, Bardlavens, and Timothy Bardlavens on LinkedIn. And yeah, I'm always having some kind of interesting conversations there.
Absolutely. And that's how I came to know you. So, and your website is also amazing. So people should go and check it
Thank you.
out too.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very
Shout out
much
to
for being with
Squarespace.
us.